Morning, everyone. My name's Leslie Head and I'm the President of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Welcome to you all and thanks for joining us for the 2021 Annual Academy. It's an absolute delight for us to welcome Professor Bronwyn Carlson this year to deliver our lecture, which is titled Culture, Nature, Climate, Indigenous Knowledge and the Environment. We were generously welcomed to country yesterday by Ngunnawal Elder Mr. Wally Bell, a custodian of the lands on which the central office of the Academy is based in Canberra. I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I express my respect for their elders past and present. And I extend this respect to all First Nations people joining us today. We are using a Zoom webinar format where only the speakers will be seen on screen, but you should know that there's over 300 of us gathered together virtually today. You can follow the discussion via Twitter, where our handle is @humanitiesAU, and via the hashtag #AAHSymposium. If you do encounter any technical difficulties, you can contact the Academy via email at events@humanities.org.au. This session is being recorded and we'll be posting it to the Academy's YouTube channel. Now, we've all been looking forward to hearing from Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who's an Aboriginal woman who was born and lives on Dharawal country in New South Wales. Bronwyn's a recognised authority on Indigenous cultural, social, intimate and political engagements on social media. She has an impressive track record of ARC Discovery grants, starting, for example, in 2013 to undertake research on Aboriginal identity and community online. Another one in 2016 to research Indigenous help seeking on social media. And her current one is undertaking research focusing on Indigenous experiences of online violence. Bronwyn's also the founding and managing editor of the Journal of Global Indigeneity and director of the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. She was elected a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities in 2020. So Bronwyn, welcome to you and handing over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for taking time today to come and listen to my lecture. I'll just like to take a moment to acknowledge where I stand, speaking currently from unceded Dharawal country, where I was born and continue to live. I'd also like to acknowledge the Wallumattagal people of the Darug Nation, whose homelands I'm fortunate enough to work on at Macquarie University. I pay my respects and gratitude to this animate land, and I extend my respect and my gratitude to the old people, the ancestors who have come before me, elders and knowledge holders who continue their work, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities across this continent who continue their custodianship, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today, and including my fabulous colleagues within the Department of Indigenous Studies, and also members of our research network, the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. As somebody whose research focuses on everyday lives of Indigenous people on digital platforms, I use memes and tweets in my presentation. Social media, for all its downfalls, does provide a place where people meet and interact, and it's a great place to test the mood of the public on issues such as the one I'm going to speak about today. And I would also like to acknowledge the other 3 Indigenous Fellows who occupy a place in this Academy. In Culture and Communication Studies, distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson, and in History, Professor Lynette Russell and Professor John Maynard. And thank you, Professor Leslie Head, for the invitation to present the 52nd Annual Academy Lecture on Culture, Nature, Climate, Humanities and the Environmental Crisis. I also just wanted to note that this week is International Transgender Awareness Week, and this is a week when transgender people and their allies take action to bring attention to the community by educating the public about who transgender people are, sharing stories and experiences, and advancing advocacy around the issues of prejudice, discrimination, and violence that affect the transgender community. So the preamble to my invitation to speak today mentions emerging scholars from many disciplines. The invitation suggests multiple possible approaches to solutions needed at this critical point in time to address the environmental threat posed to our collective existence. This menace to our survival is underscored by the rapidity of climate change, of inaction, of over 200 years of ignorance, disinterest, and the willful negation of knowledge that prior to 1788 ensured survival. This knowledge sustained us for tens of thousands of years. It is knowledge that preceded what is now seen by many as the greatest human crisis of all. Despite global efforts, conferences, symposia, and much well-intended desire to effect global change in what we do and how we do it, we are still, to borrow from a young and inspiring voice, subjected to the blah, blah, blah that speaks and does not listen. The noise is overwhelming in an atmosphere where inaction dominates. And although the science of post-colonial Western knowledge has come to recognize the crisis that has arrived, it has not yet fully understood philosophical imperatives such as custodianship and reciprocity that pre-colonized nations deployed to guarantee survival. As my colleague, Darug scholar Dr. Jo Ray notes, recognizing reciprocity as an overriding moral human imperative to care for country so that sustainable futures foster continuing presences is no longer only an Aboriginal custodial obligation. In the Anthropocene, and with devastating climate crisis across the globe, all humanity is called to address this imperative. Torres Strait Islander scholar Kerry Arabina calls for an indigenizing of ourselves to the universe and argues by listening to and learning from Indigenous knowledges, we may be able to then address the global crisis we are now faced with. So while most Australia knows who young Greta is, many have no idea about SEED. The media rarely focuses on efforts of Indigenous people, let alone our youth. SEED is a youth-based Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander climate justice network. SEED's role, as noted by their Victorian State Coordinator, Christopher Jacoby, is supporting and creating opportunities for blackfellas to organise and protect our lands and our waters. Climate change is impacting our communities first and worst. Our culture, our knowledge, and our spirit is ingrained in this land. And so the impact that's having on this land, it has on us, the people too. Rising sea levels will forcibly displace Torres Strait Islander people, while communities in the Northern Territory's Central Desert will experience more days of extreme heat. The warming, drying climate across the continent will also reduce biodiversity and potentially lead to the loss of native food sources and medicines, similar to what happened during the early days of colonization when the land was overrun by grazing livestock. Members of SEED are currently campaigning to stop fracking in the Northern Territory, a process that risks polluting groundwater and desecrates sacred sites and the homelands of many nations. So in the short 233 years, the damage to our homelands, the environment, and our people has been devastating on many levels. A people who lived and survived on these lands for over 60,000 years or more. Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge are often missing when there is any planning for the future. We are a people who have not been imagined as still being here in 2021, let alone a people who know a thing or two about survival. It is our connection to country and each other that has sustained us and meant our survival this far. I begin this paper by drawing attention to my academic focus on Indigenous studies, a discipline, or more accurately, a body of knowledge, which I see it, is not like many distinctive academic disciplines, as they are studied in the Western knowledge systems. For example, social science, law, science and technology, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, archaeology, oceanography, or museology, or any other category of knowledge that has been ascribed a prominent and distinct place in the domain of Western knowledge and Western pedagogical praxis. These discrete and distinct categories, despite lip service to interdisciplinarity, vie for dominance. They compete for funding and are often hierarchically structured as nuggets of truth that, despite overtures to the contrary, resist critical thinking when it comes to issues that demand a revision of what we think we know as truth. The discipline of law, for example, along with other discrete bodies of knowledge, holds a privileged elite place in the academy. In pre-colonized Indigenous cultures, our law was inseparable from and integral to other knowledge, one part of a system of interconnectivity that gave us life. Indigenous studies, in contrast to much academic study, is multidisciplinary in the truest sense of that term. Although we are bound by the disciplinary rules of the academy that separate and hierarchize knowledge, Indigenous studies incorporates all of those disciplinary foci and more. We make a concerted effort to teach our students to understand the world from the perspective of survival. Indigenous knowledge understands the connectivity between law and mathematics and storytelling, between plants and social structures, between inanimate objects and histories. Many may see this interdisciplinary approach to knowledge as some sort of weakness, but we see it as a strength. Indigenous knowledge does not seek to separate culture, nature, and climate, but sees these as integral, interwoven features of existence. As Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson has previously asserted, the origins of Indigenous sovereignties are in and of the earth. We draw on and assert the life force we share with and derive from creators and ancestors that inextricably tie us to the earth and our respective shared territories. Our origin stories connect us as humans and non-humans through relations and kin, through all that the earth and our creators make. This relationality that drives survival and any knowledge of planetary sustainability is embedded into Indigenous studies through the teachings of our people. For example, Aboriginal philosopher and scholar Dr. Mary Graham teaches us about relationality as a foundational principle of law, as an elaborate, complex, and refined system of social, moral, spiritual, community obligations that provided an ordered universe for people. Aboriginal law scholar Professor Irene Watson laments that today in this modern world, the will to live in a place of lawfulness is lost to the greater humanity. Watson points to the clear evidence of this view that is found in the growing list of global crisis, poverty, environmental disaster, famine, war, and violence. And she notes, what the greater humanity have come to know as law is a complex maze of rules and regulations. The body of law is buried, barely breathing. Law came to us in a song. It was sung with the rising sun. Law was sung in the walking of the Mother Earth. Law inhered in all things. Law is alive. It lives in all things. The wisdom and knowledge provided by these and other Indigenous scholars underscore our teaching and our research programs. We are fortunate and grateful to have access to them. Indigenous people across this continent, now known as Australia, have tens of thousands of years experience with which to attest the veracity of our knowledge and its capacity for observation and application. Indigenous knowledge, as I will demonstrate, is about the complexity of the human, the non-human, and the more than human worlds. Indigenous educators in Indigenous study see ourselves as constituted by and responsible to our relationships with ancestors, our current elders, and future generations. In addition, our relationality implies our land and all that is on it, living and non-living. We deploy a deconstructive pedagogical practice that queers much conventional knowledge. We introduce students to scholarly explorations of non-binary ideas of humans and more than humans, Indigenous gender continuums, sexual diversity, and notions of essentialism. Conventional ideas pertaining to human behavior, preference, and orientation are examined as part of the whole that constitutes our biodiversity as Indigenous people. As our colleague, Professor Alex Wilson states, we queer knowledge to reconstruct it according to our own worldviews and experiences. Prior to colonization, Indigenous peoples watched, listened, and learned about the vicissitudes of survival. The climate, in particular, was, to us, a force that we worked with and understood. Its vagaries and fluctuations were known entities to our forebearers, its rhythms and flows understood through surveillance and attention to detail, through thousands of years of trial and error that demanded we learn from our mistakes. In the beginning, from this standpoint, therefore, we can uncover a time before when the title of this symposium, Culture, Nature, Climate, was not, and indeed could not be measured or understood as separate entities or fields of knowledge that interacted, but were inseparable to the ontological and epistemological forces that informed our collective understanding of existence and survival. Our philosophies were based on evidence that disclosed truth about the world slowly through the consciousness of our own people's attention, observation, and sometimes, where necessary, action. And in saying this, I'm not invoking some mythical past that had its foundations in a utopian set of values that left the natural world undisturbed and unchallenged. Our forebearers had many a skirmish, both between and across cultures, and our cultures were pluralistic and heterogeneous. Pre-colonized cultures had to learn, adapt, and understand the science and contrariness of the natural world, anticipate its will, pay homage to the bounties it provided as subsistence. The tens of thousands of years of survival owe a debt to the stewards, caretakers, guardians, and keepers of knowledge, and to those who went before, whose vigilance tested observation and application and brought about a continuity of new ways of knowing and understanding the changes and variations that occurred. And I have more to say about Indigenous knowledge, but I'll now turn to the situation in which we find ourselves, in which informs the theme of this symposium. There is a mountain of information about the impact of climate change in Australia and its devastating effects. And I'm sure much of this will be disclosed during this symposium over the next few days. To say we are at a crisis point is almost an understatement, as every expert on the topic will attest. So according to the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which is a body that monitors and reports on biodiversity, Australia has a biodiversity loss between 5 and 10%. And this ranks Australia second worst in the group of 109 countries. Indigenous people comprise less than 5% of the world's population, and yet 80% of global biodiversity is located on Indigenous lands. Indigenous cultures are defined according to their relationship with biodiversity. Practices, beliefs, and social and cultural values are not only connected to biodiversity, but are a product of it. Colonization introduced new organisms and continues to eliminate many vital species that prior to invasion were integral to culture and cultural practices and to life itself. The influence of human interference, action, and more recently inaction continues to wreak havoc on a significant number of biological ecosystems that are in danger of disappearing entirely. Only recently, we saw the devastation of the horror of the summer bushfires across the homelands of people on the East Coast and other parts of the continent. The bushfires were unprecedented in this area and ravaged 5.8 million hectares and killed an estimated billion more than human ancestors. Walbunja elder Auntie Vivian Mason said, Aboriginal people knew these fires were coming a long time ago, but people chose not to listen. Auntie Vivian states that there were plenty of signs given to us and we knew that something was going to happen. A lot of people weren't prepared for it, but us blackfellas knew. Fire is one of our elements. We respect the earth, the air, the water, and fire. Without fire, we wouldn't survive. It's part of us, as is the air, water, and earth. They balance one another. Auntie Vivian's point about balance is something our people have long understood and is a principle that seems absent from many discussions about climate change. Balance, by definition, is a delicate thing that depends on synchronicity and symbiosis. Balance does not always just occur in nature, despite views to the contrary. It sometimes needs help, reverence, and respect for the ebbs and flows of the vast ecosystems beyond our planet. It takes many thousands of years to understand balance and the causes of imbalance. As Auntie Vivian notes, and I quote, "We noticed quite a few years back, we're not into all this science about climate change because we don't need that. We knew something was wrong. The fish were late traveling, things weren't blooming, growing, fish weren't biting. The seafood was dwindling at a rapid rate. And it was all to do with the water quality, the weather and nature not working with the rest of the community," end quote. Now, Auntie Vivian's refutation of climate science is not simply a denunciation. Rather, it's an affirmation that our knowledge preceded Western science and that our people often know what the problems and solutions are. Colonization disconnected our people from the ecological systems that they were part of, they belonged to, and depended upon in the reciprocity of flows and forces that sustained life. As Ewan man, Uncle Nook Noel Webster notes, the difference between cultural fire practice and Western fire management regime is the disconnection of people. Uncle Nook claims that today people are disconnected from the landscape and from country. In old practice years ago, people connected, lived, and walked within a cultural space. So when we have a disconnection and remove people from the landscape, we begin to see imbalance. And through that imbalance comes bad fire. We need to try and reset the health of the landscape. The very notion of firefighting is an aversion to us. You cannot fight fire. You learn to understand it, respect it, place its place in regeneration, manage it carefully, and avoid its danger. While none of this is new knowledge to our people, it is clear that increasingly over the past couple of decades in particular, government and scientists have turned to Indigenous people in a bid to access the knowledge that our people have accumulated over tens of thousands of years. We hold knowledge that has at its core the sole intention of preservation and conservation. So when we say the land owns us, this is not a mere mantra of new agey proportions. We understand that this belief is essential to the survival of the global ecosystems that sustain and support biodiversity. Biodiversity is not simply a Western environmental preoccupation. Loss of species has enormous consequences, medically, for agriculture, for economies, for survival. In fact, as we know, there is very little that is not affected over time by the widespread loss of species. When balance becomes so disturbingly skewed due to the species destruction brought about by human-made action, there comes a point of no return. Many Indigenous people globally think and fear we have reached that point. The relatively recent newfound interest in Indigenous ways of knowing and being comes as a cost to Indigenous people. Such knowledge is our collective legacy and is not simply up for grabs without recognition of our intellectual property rights. This is a massive minefield whereby we continue to negotiate our rights to our knowledge and our access under Western legalese to ownership and patents. Navigating this terrain is complex, it's time-consuming and often unsuccessful. While vast areas of land are logged, seas overfished, the earth mined for capitalist interests, vast tracts of land increasingly urbanized, and so on in the continuity of the colonial project. In the face of all this, Indigenous knowledge is selectively sought out at crisis moments or where it is deemed useful for Big Pharma or for the vast money-making projects that we at times have little choice to bow to for their promise of jobs, our very late welcome into the post-invasion capitalist enterprise. Our collective cynicism is the unsurprising result of colonial history and its violence on our people, our lands, and our cultures. According to the Parliamentary Library, the following distinctive features characterize Indigenous knowledge: collective rights and interests held by Indigenous people in their knowledge, close interdependence between knowledge, land, and other aspects of culture in Indigenous societies, oral transmission of knowledge in accordance with well-understood cultural principles, and rules regarding secrecy and sacredness that govern the management of knowledge. Now, I point to this template as it is indicative of all government templates on issues of significant ethical importance to Indigenous people. Primarily, this can be conceived as lip service, particularly given the recent wrangling and large-scale inaction regarding climate change and its consequences. Additionally, the lack of any rights or protection under Australian law, such as the previous slide indicated, our histories are being destroyed regularly to serve the interest of the mining industry, for one. The above list of features says little really. It's very typical of governmental language, pointing to a few concepts without providing any explanation as to what they actually mean. What are these collective rights and interests? What constitutes the interdependence mentioned? What are well understood cultural principles? What are the rules about secrecy and sacredness? This shorthand methodology is commonplace and serves to stand in for any deep comprehensive understanding of Indigenous knowledge. It's typical of the organization of Western knowledge into categories, numerical fields of operation and classifications. Such litanies possibly hold some meaning for some folk, but they do nothing to explain, to understand, or to critically think about the differences between Indigenous knowledge and the Western epistemes that have got us into this mess. Many will recall the Hindmarsh Island Bridge dispute of the 1990s that led to the Royal Commission in South Australia and much debate about the notion of secret and sacred knowledge. In this case, Ngarrindjeri people were forced to fight within the Western legal system to protect their country and sacred sites. The Royal Commissioner disagreed with Ngarrindjeri people and sided with developers. And this is a familiar story to many about knowledge and credibility, and about whose knowledge and voices are valued and believed, and more significantly, whose are disbelieved or dismissed. This is a story of dispossession, colonialism, and violence. Much could be said here about advanced capitalism, but I'll keep to the script. The link to the above so-called distinctive features of Indigenous knowledge is provided, and to be fair, there is a bit of an attempt to explain the principles outlined, but we need to think about Indigenous knowledge in a far more complex way, using language that exceeds terms like interdependence and cultural specificity. We, Indigenous people, and you, our allies, need to develop a more robust language that tells the story of colonialism as it continues to deplete our lands, our species, our trees and fish, and our people. So what I'm proposing here is that we, all of us, develop a more radical approach to this crisis. The symposium is directed at humanities and the environmental crisis. Clearly, there is much rigorous work to be done by various discrete fields of inquiry. What I'm proposing is a more collective and collaborative effort, one that seeks to understand how survival was possible prior to 1788. Individual disciplinary attempts to demonstrate expertise that will answer this and connect an answer to a new way of understanding are evident in some fields, but there is a wealth of research that often lacks a collective authority and a focused consultation and collaboration with Indigenous people. Biodiversity is a term often associated with flora and fauna and the extinction of more than 99.9% of species that ever occupied the earth, over 5 billion species. Well, it's claimed in that most knowledgeable space, Wikipedia. But I'd like to pause momentarily, though, for the purpose of this particular symposium, to extrapolate biodiversity as a concept that would work well in the humanities. I want to draw a parallel between loss of biodiversity and lack of biodiversity. A long bow, you might be thinking, but bear with me. So let's consider biodiversity in the humanities as a set of practices. How does biodiversity work here? For example, let's think about the way in which research is funded, and particularly research that is focused on Indigenous knowledges, people, and communities. The Future Fellowship Scheme comes to mind, and the recent debate across social media when it was realised that of the millions invested in research, and particularly Indigenous topics, very few Indigenous researchers were awarded. So in 2019, for example, of the 100 successful Future Fellowships awarded, no Indigenous researchers were successful, despite 5 Indigenous focused projects being awarded. As my colleague, Wiradjuri scholar, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan, rightfully pointed out, the Future Fellowship funding is not just about growing meaningful research, it's specifically about growing an academic workforce. So referring to the 2019 results, they stated, and we're typically, and in this year, fully missing from it. In 2020, and again in 2021, only 1 Indigenous researcher was funded, despite numerous Indigenous focused projects. Thinking about Torres Strait Islander scholar Professor Martin Nakada's rigorous attempt at savaging the disciplines, we can see that the rigidity of Western knowledge systems is still very much in situ. I draw from Professor Nakada's work here as a global scholar whose work on critiquing the Cambridge expedition of scientists and academics in the Torres Straits in the 1890s. This work challenges the authority of Western knowledge and lays bare the disparity between what Western science observed and documented and what Torres Strait Islander people knew about themselves. This work is freely available online and, in my view, provides a deep understanding of the difference between Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, the latter a system that has and continues to exclude us as it simultaneously seeks to know and commodify our knowledge systems. I understand that this sets up a dichotomy of seemingly irreconcilable epistemologies. However, I hasten to add that they need not be irreconcilable. Indigenous people have always been generous and forthcoming. What makes these ways of knowing difficult to reconcile is the entrenched belief in white supremacy that accompanies much knowledge produced about us. Nakada's critique on the 1890s is relevant today. There is a continuous pattern where non-Indigenous people are provided with not only the means to conduct research on us and about us, but the opportunities to advance within the academy across a range of disciplines as experts. Box-ticking exercises that are underscored by the metrics of research paper demands serve an individual purpose, and we're all well aware of their perceived value to our careers and to the university more broadly. But what about the wider national and global implications of collective research that is informed by a deep understanding of Indigenous epistemology? What about projects and potential careers that will secure employment for Indigenous scholars? Let us just contemplate a little more closely how biodiversity works in this organisation. In this academy, for example, there are 4 full Indigenous members. Consider that. 3 of those 4 have only been recently appointed. So prior to this, there was 1 Indigenous member across all 11 fields of inquiry. So let me relate my own progression into the academy. In November of 2020, I received confirmation that I had been elected as a member of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. This was a very exciting moment that was celebrated across social media with many tweets and messages of congratulations. As someone who's often felt like an imposter in academia, primarily because that's how Indigenous scholars are often made feel, my appointment was rather monumental. I soon realised that I was elected along with 2 other Indigenous scholars, Emeritus Professor John Maynard and Distinguished Professor Aileen Morton Robinson. And I felt very honoured to be in such prestigious company. Both have contributed significantly to the Academy in their respective disciplines, while also building the canon of knowledge for Indigenous studies. While I was basking in the excitement of being elected with such significant Indigenous scholars, I also began to think about how their work had provided me with a strong foundation of knowledge that informed my own work. Their research always encouraged me to think deeper and to be more critical of the information that is produced about us as opposed to by us. So I began then to question why such scholars were not already members of such a prestigious academy, given their lengthy careers and the fact that they are considered by many of us as the pioneers who literally kicked down the doors so people like me could be in the academy. So when I began my university journey back in 1999 as an Indigenous Studies and Sociology student, there was little in the academy to reflect Indigenous people or Indigenous knowledges. The 2 main texts that shaped me as a scholar and that were published in 1999 were Professor Linda Tuiwai-Smith's book, Decolonising Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People, and the second was Professor Aileen Morton Robinson's Talking Up to White Women, Indigenous Women and Feminism. Both of these were and remain pioneering scholarly works that changed the direction of Indigenous studies, laying the foundation for the highly political and, some might say, radical body of knowledge that it is today. Both of these texts shape my thinking and inform my analysis to this day. Non-Indigenous scholars also seized on these and ensuing texts, putting them on courses that informed history and philosophy and feminism and sociology and cultural studies and many humanities fields of knowledge. So this digression and these ponderings are not a rebuke. Rather, they are pertinent questions that remind me of the way I had to and still have to search for Indigenous diversity within academia in order to find my eminent peers recognized and acknowledged for the gifts that they offer, and for the knowledge they bring to bear and the intellectual guidance they provide to us and our students, and not to mention their significant contribution to the institutions, these same institutions that so often to authorize their knowledge and wisdom. Indigenous knowledge is the reason I am here today in this position, speaking at this prestigious forum. It is not it is core not just to our business, but to our biodiversity as a race of people who completely understand what it means to lose biodiversity as a people and as entities within an ecosystem of magnificently diverse proportions. Biodiversity comprises a massive structure of operations that demands care and nourishment and depends for its existence on reciprocity. Loss of biodiversity is not new to us. For our people, it is a consequence of colonization and its enduringness. For Indigenous lands and cultural practices, stories and knowledge systems, loss of diversity has tragic consequences. We know and understand the devastation it wreaks. So this is why many of the findings at the recent COP26 climate summit are not a revelation to us. We are not surprised by the refusal of governments to acquiesce to agreements that will alleviate this current crisis, nor do we feign shock at the moral bankruptcy of leaders who utter slogans such as can-do capitalism and the Australian way. Far from being conceptualized in a neat list of characteristics, Indigenous knowledge is constituted by experiences that in some ways are difficult to pin down or characterize, precisely because this cumulative understanding of the world exceeds the boundaries of English linguistic expression. Knowledge in our cultures can often be understood without language, in silence, or in artworks or dance or song. Indigenous knowledge is not non-verbal, but neither is it necessarily always verbal. Some knowledge is sacred and according to specific knowledge holders. These may be gendered, but are not necessarily subject to gender hierarchies or the way in which colonialism has defined what we now know or understand about gender. There are many things I do not know, nor should I know. Our knowledge systems differ fundamentally, therefore, from Western knowledge, where curiosity and a thirst for knowledge are considered not only positive, but essential to what is deemed good scholarship. Conversely, Indigenous people are often taught to know their place within the knowledge system. Such an idea is anathema to Western thinking, as attested by this image that accompanies this lecture, which functions to appropriate the outback in a bid to connote imagery that appears inclusive or knowledgeable, or reminiscent of a moment in time when the pouring of earth from hand to hand signified a strident attempt at social change. The knowledge predicted by this image provides a concrete example of the stark difference between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems, between what Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people understand as biodiversity. I see this image possibly different to many others. The knowledge inscribed in this picture tells me how I am framed, or how I should be framed, or how I should frame my paper, and that is, as an Indigenous person, I'm bound to know about the desert. I did not, nor would I probably have selected this picture, which stereotypifies Indigenous people as an outback group, in contrast to the reality of approximately 82% urban population. According to this image, Indigenous people are not only seen as desert people connected to nature, as noble savages. Now, I draw this to our attention to reiterate, not in disrespect. But if we're going to discuss the loss of biodiversity only as an effect of climate change without simultaneously acknowledging the effects of what Bell Hooks calls white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and our own implication in those systems of domination and subordination that subjugate and subdue all manner of diversity, we learn nothing. As a sociologist and an Indigenous Studies scholar, I have danced careful steps to balance competing knowledge systems, to synthesize sociology with a different kind of knowledge. I have been forced to think about biodiversity not as an event that is an effect of inaction or overconsumption, but as a multitudinous reality that permeates all aspects of survival. Biodiversity includes all life forms. It is crucial to health and well-being of all spaces in nature and culture, and indeed in the academy. So I want to conclude this lecture by inviting all of us to consider carefully the notion of biodiversity in its most broad philosophical sense. And to do this, I draw from the work of eminent scholar, Professor Martin Nakada, who was a mentor to me and was my PhD supervisor, and who theorized the cultural interface as a bridge that spans Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. The cultural interface is a conduit that has the potential to close the epistemic divide between competing ways of knowing and understanding the world. Professor Nakada sees Indigenous studies as the study of how we, Indigenous people, have been studied, circumscribed, represented, and how this knowledge of us is limited in its ability to understand us. Professor Nakada formulated the concept of the cultural interface as a way of theorizing the real and symbolic space Indigenous people occupy daily as they traverse the limitations of that lack of understanding. As we navigate the difficult, fraught, and sometimes violent terrains of authority that seeks to name us, know us, manage us, include us, exclude us, we occupy the cultural interface. We navigate, negotiate, comply, and resist. We exert agency, and as Nakada says, we intervene and find productive spaces from where to exercise power. Indigenous studies takes place at the cultural interface. As a discipline in the humanities, it acts as a point of entry for Indigenous knowledge systems and allows them to be brought into broader conversations about diversity and biodiversity and climate change more generally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. Thanks so much for your lecture. You've given us lots of challenges there, challenges to disciplinary thinking, challenges to how the research ecosystem works, challenges to the Academy of Humanities itself. And we thank you for your challenges and for the generosity with which you've laid them out and with which you've called for greater collaboration. I think I can acknowledge on behalf of the Academy that we do share and acknowledge these concerns, and we're thinking about how to work on them together. So I hope we can discuss that further soon. Thank you everyone for your participation today. You have to imagine 300 people clapping, Bronwyn, and we don't have a question and answer session because it's a plenary lecture. But Bronwyn's, of course, at Macquarie Uni, and you know where to find her if you want to follow up on any of those points. Please, everyone, join us for our next session of the symposium, which is on Thursday. That's called Listening to the Ancestors, from 11 a.m. Eastern Time. This is already proving to be a very popular session, and I encourage you to register on the Academy website. So thanks again to Bronwyn, and thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.